This story is a work of historical fiction inspired by controversial and unsettling themes. It does not promote, glorify, or encourage immoral or unlawful relationships of any kind. Instead, it explores the psychological, social, and historical consequences of a forbidden marriage set during the American Civil War in 1863 Louisiana. Reader discretion is strongly advised, as the narrative touches on sensitive subjects such as abuse of power, coercion, and taboo relationships. The purpose of this story is to shed light on the complexities of human behavior under extreme circumstances, not to justify them. As the months of 1863 stretched on, the granddaughter's presence inside the plantation house became both a comfort and a curse. The girl was no longer a child, but not yet fully a woman, her youth caught in that fragile stage where innocence and maturity blur together. She filled the empty spaces of the house with her quiet footsteps, her soft humming, and her attempts to bring some semblance of warmth to a place that had grown cold with time. For the grandfather, her presence became an anchor. Each day he relied more on her company, not only for conversation but for survival of the spirit. The war had stripped him of allies, friends, and sons. She alone remained, her face a reflection of the family he once commanded. When she read aloud from scripture in the evenings, her voice soothed him in ways prayer no longer could. When she tended to the gardens or helped mend clothing, he found himself watching her, studying the ease of her youth, the gentle sway of her movements. But such attention did not go unnoticed. The servants in the household, bound by fear yet unable to ignore what they saw, whispered in corners. "He watches her too closely," one murmured. "She never leaves his side," another added. Their suspicions spread like wildfire through the few remaining families in the area. And yet, gossip had little power during wartime. With husbands away, churches weakened, and law enforcement stretched thin, there was no authority to challenge him. The silence of society became his shield. For the girl, confusion reigned. She longed for affection, for family, for a sense of belonging. Her parents were gone, her world had collapsed, and her grandfather was the only pillar left standing. His attention, though suffocating, was also her only source of security. At times she even felt gratitude for his care. But beneath that gratitude lay unease, a tightening in her chest when his hand lingered too long on her shoulder, or when his eyes seemed to study her not as a granddaughter but as something else. The lines between affection and obsession blurred quietly. The grandfather began excusing her from community gatherings, insisting she remain home. "The roads aren't safe," he told her. "The people will gossip. Best you stay close." Though his words carried reason, his motives ran deeper. He did not want her out of his sight. He wanted her tucked safely inside the crumbling walls of the plantation where only he could look upon her. Evenings grew longer. He invited her to dine with him in the great hall, though the table that once hosted banquets now bore only 2 plates. He asked her to sit by the fire with him, to read until her voice grew hoarse, to play old hymns on the worn piano though her hands trembled from the weight of his gaze. Slowly, she became less a granddaughter and more the center of his universe, a role she neither sought nor understood. In the quiet of the nights, she wrestled with guilt. She told herself that her grandfather's attention was harmless, that she owed him her loyalty for keeping her safe. And yet, in the deepest corners of her mind, she felt the wrongness of it all. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, she no longer recognized herself. She saw not a girl but a prisoner of affection that threatened to turn into something much darker. Outside the plantation gates, rumors thickened. Neighbors whispered that the old man had lost his senses, that grief had driven him into sin. Some dismissed it as idle talk born of jealousy. Others, however, avoided the plantation altogether, as if it were cursed. Still, no one confronted him. Power, fear, and the chaos of war combined to keep the whispers at bay. And so the dependence deepened. She clung to him out of need, and he clung to her out of obsession. Each passing day tied their fates more tightly together, weaving a bond that would soon defy both law and morality. What had begun as a refuge in times of grief now grew into the shadow of a scandal. One that, if exposed, would shock even a world already torn apart by war. By late 1863, the war outside the plantation walls grew harsher. News arrived of more Confederate losses, whispers of Union advances, and the crumbling of the South's once unshakable pride. But inside the plantation, another kind of war brewed. One fought not with rifles and cannon fire, but within the mind of an aging man desperate to cling to power and legacy. The grandfather began to justify what others would call unthinkable. At first, his thoughts came in fleeting moments, quickly buried beneath scripture and the memory of his long-dead wife. But as nights stretched on and loneliness pressed in, those thoughts hardened into conviction. He told himself that what he felt was not sin but destiny, not corruption but preservation. The girl, his granddaughter, represented everything he feared losing. She was youth in a dying world, family in a house emptied by war, continuity in an age where death stalked every corner. To him, she was the vessel of survival, the last thread of blood that tied him to the future. And so, in the quiet of his study, he whispered to himself, "If she is my blood, then surely God has chosen her to preserve it." Rationalization became his armor. He drew upon twisted fragments of scripture, bending sacred words to serve his desires. He reminded himself that kings of old had taken wives far younger than he, that dynasties had often intermarried to preserve their lineage. The world is collapsing, he thought. What is morality in the face of survival? His obsession turned into planning. He began to imagine a future where she was not merely his companion but his wife, where the plantation, crumbling as it was, could still bear fruit through heirs born of his own blood. The idea was shocking even to him at first, but the more he entertained it, the less it felt like madness and the more it felt like inevitability. The granddaughter, however, lived in confusion. She noticed how he had grown bolder in his presence, how his gaze lingered longer, how his words carried hints of ownership rather than guardianship. At dinner, he began to speak of legacy and bloodlines, of how families must endure by any means necessary. She nodded quietly, unsure what he truly meant, her heart tightening as she realized his affection was changing shape. The servants felt it too. They saw the way he protected her not as a grandfather but as a man guarding a treasure. Their whispers grew darker. He means to keep her for himself. Some considered fleeing the plantation, fearing that staying would bind them to scandal. Yet the war made escape perilous, and so they stayed, bound by circumstance as tightly as the girl herself. In the community, rumors swirled. Some dismissed them as tales born of envy. Others swore they were true. Still, no one dared confront the man. He had wealth, influence, and the intimidating presence of someone who had survived where many others had perished. Silence, once again, was his greatest ally. The grandfather's rationalization reached its peak one stormy night. Sitting by the fire with his granddaughter reading softly beside him, he looked upon her not with the eyes of kin but with the hunger of a man convinced of his right. "You are all that remains," he murmured, almost to himself. "Without you, everything I've built dies with me." She glanced up, puzzled by the weight of his words. He offered a faint smile, hiding the storm within him. But in that moment his decision solidified. He would not let her slip away. He would bind her to him, not as granddaughter to grandfather, but as wife to husband. And so the path toward the forbidden marriage was set. What had begun as grief, shaped into dependence, twisted into obsession, now hardened into intent. The old man's heart was resolved, his mind justified, his soul blind to the horror of what he planned. The granddaughter, still trapped by fear and loyalty, had no idea that the darkest chapter of her life was about to begin. By the winter of 1863, the plantation seemed cloaked in silence, its vast fields barren and its halls echoing with emptiness. Outside, war raged with greater ferocity, yet inside, another battle was being waged. A battle between morality and desire, secrecy and exposure. The grandfather had already made his choice. In his mind, the marriage was no longer an idea but an inevitable truth. Now all that remained was the act itself. But how could such a thing be done in a world still ruled, at least on paper, by church and law. He knew no respectable minister would dare sanction a union between a man and his granddaughter. The very thought would send shockwaves through the congregation, ignite fury among neighbors, and invite condemnation upon his name. Yet desperation often finds willing hands, and the grandfather had power still. Wealth hidden in strongboxes, favors owed, and the ability to silence those who might protest. It was through whispers and quiet meetings that he found the man to do it. A preacher of fading reputation, one who had long been shunned by his peers for greed and moral weakness, was willing to bend to the old man's will. The price was steep, not just in gold but in promise of protection, but the grandfather paid it without hesitation. To him, no sum was too great for what he considered his destiny. The granddaughter knew little of these arrangements. When the grandfather spoke to her, it was in riddles of duty and survival, a family bound by something stronger than law. She resisted at first, insisting she was too young, that it was wrong, that she could not understand why he spoke of marriage when he was her blood. But her protests were smothered beneath his authority. "The world does not care for what is proper anymore," he told her one evening, his voice firm yet calm. "If we do not protect ourselves, no one will. You are my blood, my future, and you will remain with me." She felt trapped, bound by grief and fear, her world too small to imagine escape. With no family to turn to and war devouring every corner of the South, she had little choice but to submit. The night of the ceremony arrived without announcement. Only a handful of witnesses were present, loyal servants sworn to silence, the preacher bought with coin, and the flickering glow of candles casting shadows on the walls. The plantation's great hall, once filled with laughter and banquets, now bore the weight of secrecy. The granddaughter stood trembling, her hands cold, her face pale. She wore no wedding dress, only a simple gown, yet the moment carried the dreadful weight of permanence. The preacher's words echoed hollowly through the room, his voice shaky but steady enough to fulfill the ritual. He spoke of union, of family, of the will of God, though every word was laced with hypocrisy. The grandfather answered firmly, his deep voice filling the space. When it came to the granddaughter, her voice faltered, breaking beneath the weight of expectation. But with the old man's hand gripping hers tightly, she whispered the vow that sealed her fate. When it was done, silence fell heavier than any blessing. The preacher gathered his pay quickly, avoiding her gaze, and vanished into the stormy night. The servants lowered their heads, fearful of what they had witnessed, knowing that to speak of it would mean ruin. And the grandfather, now husband in his own mind, looked upon the girl not as kin but as possession, his victory complete. For the granddaughter, the night felt like a burial. A part of her soul seemed to wither as the candles burned low, leaving her in a union she neither wanted nor understood. She had become the center of a secret so terrible it could never see the light of day. Every door seemed closed, every path of escape sealed by war, fear, and the authority of the man who now claimed her. From that night forward, the plantation ceased to be merely a home. It became a prison of silence, where the walls themselves seemed to whisper of the forbidden act that had taken place within them. Outside, the war continued to rage, but inside, another battle was just beginning. The granddaughter's struggle to endure the unbearable weight of her fate. The winter of 1863 gave way to a weary spring, and though the fields outside the plantation stirred with faint green, the household itself sank deeper into shadows. The secret marriage had been sealed, yet secrecy has a way of leaking through cracks no matter how tightly it is bound. Whispers began to stir beyond the gates, faint at first, then louder with every passing week. Neighbors noticed the change in the young woman. She seldom appeared in public anymore, and when she did, her eyes seemed hollow, her posture burdened by something unseen. Gone was the carefree innocence of a girl who once clung to stories of her father. In its place was the silence of a woman pressed into a role she could not speak of. The old man, however, carried himself with renewed authority. His shoulders straightened. His voice grew commanding again, as though the marriage had restored his crumbling pride. It did not take long for tongues to wag. "Why is she never at church?" whispered one woman during Sunday service. "Why does he guard her so fiercely?" asked another. The war had fractured society, but scandal still thrived. Even with husbands gone and towns in disarray, gossip found fertile ground in suspicion. Some said the girl was ill, others claimed she was simply shy, but the most daring suggested something darker, that the old man had bound her in ways no grandfather should. The church, though weakened by war, could not entirely ignore such rumors. A minister from a nearby parish attempted to visit the plantation, under the guise of offering prayer. But he was turned away at the gates by loyal servants, instructed to tell him that the master was too occupied with war matters to receive guests. The refusal only deepened suspicion. Soon the whispers grew sharper. "He hides her because he has sinned." Inside the house, the granddaughter felt the walls closing in. She heard the murmurs carried by servants who tried to shield her. Yet she knew the truth was seeping into the world outside. At night, she prayed desperately for deliverance, for the war to end, for someone, anyone, to intervene. But her prayers echoed unanswered through the hollow halls. The grandfather, meanwhile, dismissed the rumors with cold confidence. "Let them talk," he told her one evening, his hand resting heavily on hers. "Their words are powerless. I have what is mine, and no one can take it from me." Yet not even he could fully silence the tension building beyond his gates. Neighbors began to keep their distance, fearful of being entangled in scandal. Invitations ceased. Even Confederate officers stationed nearby, once eager to call upon the plantation for hospitality, visited less frequently, wary of the cloud of rumor that hung over the estate. What had once been a seat of influence now became a fortress of shame. The granddaughter's inner world fractured further. Every glance from a servant, every whisper from beyond the door, felt like a dagger of judgment. She wanted to cry out, to beg for release, but the bonds of fear held her tongue. To defy him meant risking wrath, perhaps even ruin, for she had nowhere else to go. The war had left her alone in the world, and he reminded her of that often. "You have no one but me," he would say. "Without me, you are nothing." The scandal grew, but still no one dared act. War was chaos, and morality seemed a luxury in a world where survival was all that mattered. And yet, deep within the community, anger simmered. Some believed the plantation was cursed, a place where God's wrath would soon fall. Others pitied the young woman, whispering prayers for her soul. The weight of secrecy grew unbearable within the house. The granddaughter walked its halls as though carrying chains, her every step heavy with dread. She could not laugh. She could not sing. She could not even dream without guilt clouding her mind. For her, life had become a living silence, an endless echo of the vows forced upon her beneath candlelight. And still, the grandfather held her close, blind to the storm gathering around them, convinced that his will alone could silence the world forever. But outside the plantation walls, war and rumor alike gathered strength, threatening to consume them both. By mid-1864, the war crept ever closer to Louisiana's plantations. The thunder of cannon fire echoed faintly across the horizon, carried by the wind. Union troops advanced, their presence growing bolder as Confederate lines collapsed. Smoke from burned fields could be seen in the distance, and rumors of soldiers seizing homes spread like wildfire. Inside the old plantation, the grandfather treated the war as both a curse and a shield. He feared the loss of his lands and the wrath of Union soldiers, yet he also saw in the chaos a kind of protection. In times like these, who would dare waste energy on scandal? Neighbors had their own troubles: food shortages, fleeing families, collapsing farms. If whispers of his forbidden marriage lingered, they were drowned by the roar of war. But for the granddaughter, the coming of soldiers felt like the possibility of change. Each sound of marching boots on distant roads stirred both fear and hope within her. Perhaps the war would free her, she thought. Perhaps the outside world would shatter the prison of silence she had been forced into. Yet hope was dangerous. If the soldiers came and spared nothing, she might lose her life along with her chance at freedom. The community, however, had not forgotten. To some, the scandal of the forbidden marriage became a dark story told in secret, a symbol of everything rotten within the old Southern order. "It is no wonder the South is falling," one neighbor whispered. "When men commit such sins, how can God grant us victory?" The marriage became less about the two people trapped in it and more about what it represented. The decay of a world that once claimed honor but had allowed corruption to fester at its core. Inside the plantation, tension rose with every passing day. The grandfather grew more protective, forbidding his granddaughter to even approach the gates. His obsession deepened, and his paranoia grew. He believed that soldiers, neighbors, and even servants plotted to take her away from him. She, meanwhile, grew paler, quieter, her spirit dimming beneath the weight of a secret too heavy to bear. When the first Union patrols finally appeared on nearby roads, the servants trembled. Some prayed for deliverance, others feared retribution. The granddaughter watched from a window, her heart pounding. But the grandfather stood tall, determined to defend his house, his land, and his forbidden union. "This plantation will not fall," he declared, blind to the truth that it already had from within. The war was no longer at the gates. It was in their hearts, tearing at the fragile threads that bound them. Soon, fire, betrayal, and judgment would decide their fate. The summer of 1864 brought with it more than the rumble of war. It brought a revelation that shook the granddaughter to her core. She was with child. At first, she dismissed the signs: fatigue, nausea, the faint changes in her body. But as weeks passed, the truth became undeniable. Alone in her chamber, she pressed trembling hands to her stomach, horror flooding her soul. The forbidden marriage had already been a prison of secrecy, but now the chains tightened with unbearable weight. A child meant proof, a living, breathing embodiment of everything they had hidden in shadows. No amount of whispers or denials could erase such evidence. To her, the thought of bringing the child into the world filled her with dread. What kind of life could it possibly have? Born of sin, trapped by shame, despised by neighbors, cursed by God. When the grandfather learned of her condition, his reaction was not horror but triumph. His eyes lit with pride, as though the child were proof of victory over death itself. "Do you see?" he told her, gripping her shoulders firmly. "Our bloodline will live on. Even if the world crumbles, we will endure." His voice carried certainty, but beneath it lay obsession. He saw the child not as a soul but as a legacy, his legacy. The granddaughter wept when he spoke of the future, for she saw only ruin. The scandal that had been contained within walls would soon spill outward. Servants already knew. They exchanged fearful glances and whispered of curses. Outside, neighbors speculated that her seclusion meant more than modesty. Some even claimed she was already bearing the proof of sin. The young woman prayed nightly, begging for strength, for escape, for forgiveness. She longed to run, to flee into the chaos of war, even if it meant death. Better that than raising a child in chains of shame. But the plantation, guarded fiercely by her grandfather, allowed no freedom. He watched her closer than ever, certain that fate itself had blessed his unholy union. The war outside grew bloodier, but inside the plantation, the true battle raged in silence. With each passing month, her secret became harder to hide, and the weight of judgment grew heavier. She could not stop the future from coming. The child would arrive, and with it the final breaking point, for her, for him, and for all who whispered of the forbidden marriage. By the autumn of 1864, the storm could no longer be contained. The granddaughter's pregnancy, once whispered of behind closed doors, became an undeniable truth. The servants could not keep their silence forever, and neighbors who had long avoided the plantation now spoke openly of sin and corruption. The story spread like wildfire. An old man who had wed his granddaughter, and now a child born of it. For many, it was no longer just scandal. It was a curse, proof that the old Southern order had rotted from within. The Civil War was crashing upon Louisiana with merciless force. Union patrols drew closer, seizing plantations, setting fire to fields, and dismantling the pride of Confederate landowners. The grandfather, once a man of iron authority, grew paranoid and violent. He barricaded the plantation, armed loyal servants, and swore that no soldier, no preacher, no neighbor would take away what he claimed as his. But his grip on reality frayed. Where he saw triumph in the coming child, others saw abomination. The granddaughter's despair deepened. Each night she dreamed of escape, but her body grew heavy with the burden of pregnancy, and her spirit, though desperate, was shackled by fear. Still, within her flickered a fragile ember of resolve. If the war could not free her, perhaps betrayal from within would. And betrayal came. A servant, unable to bear the weight of secrecy, slipped away under cover of night and spoke to Union soldiers encamped nearby. The tale he told was enough to ignite outrage. To the soldiers, it was more than gossip. It was a symbol of the cruelty and corruption of the Southern elite, the very justification for their war. One night, the sound of boots thundered across the fields. Union soldiers stormed the plantation, their torches casting flames against the dark. The grandfather roared in fury, clutching his rifle, shouting defiance. But the world he clung to was already gone. Shots rang out, glass shattered, and the once proud plantation fell into chaos. The granddaughter, trembling and weeping, was pulled from the house by servants desperate to save her. Behind her, fire consumed the great hall where the forbidden vows had once been whispered. The grandfather fought until the end, but his strength was no match for the flames and bullets that closed around him. His voice, once commanding, was silenced in smoke and ash. When dawn broke, the plantation was nothing more than blackened ruins. The granddaughter, weak and weary, survived, but at a cost. She carried within her both the child of her shame and the heavy scars of her past. The war would march on, the South would fall, and her story would linger only in whispers, of a forbidden marriage, of fire and betrayal, of a legacy that ended in ashes. Thus ended the tale of the grandfather and his granddaughter. A story buried in scandal, yet remembered as a haunting echo of a world consumed by its own decay. Years passed after the flames reduced the plantation to ash, yet the story of the forbidden marriage did not die with it. Survivors carried it like a ghost in their memories, and neighbors repeated it as a cautionary tale whispered in hushed voices. In Louisiana's parishes, mothers warned their daughters of the dangers of blind obedience, of men who cloaked sin in the guise of legacy and power. The granddaughter's fate remained shrouded in shadow. Some claimed she died giving birth to the child of silence, her body too frail to endure both war and shame. Others believed she lived on in obscurity, raising the child far from the ruins of Louisiana, determined to break free from the curse her grandfather had placed upon her. Whichever truth was real, the weight of her suffering left its mark upon the generations that followed. The child's existence itself became legend. If the baby lived, it was said to have carried a darkness that no one could ignore, a reminder of sin, a living echo of the forbidden vow. Families who whispered of it used the tale to warn against pride, lust, and unchecked authority. If the child died, some claimed it was God's judgment, a cleansing fire to erase what should never have been. As time marched forward, the Civil War ended, slavery was abolished, and Louisiana struggled to rebuild from ruin. Yet amid new beginnings, old wounds lingered. In decaying cemeteries, locals pointed to unmarked graves and swore they belonged to the family cursed by its own blood. Others claimed that the land where the plantation once stood remained barren, as if scorched not just by war, but by sin itself. Historians later uncovered fragments of the tale, court records of scandal, sermons condemning the unnatural union, and letters written by horrified neighbors. To scholars, it became more than gossip. It became a window into the desperation of a collapsing world, where power clung to itself even at the cost of morality. To storytellers, it became a legend, a dark, tragic chapter in the haunted history of the South. And so the story endured, not as romance, not as triumph, but as warning. A tale of a man who sought to bend blood and time to his will, and a young woman who paid the price. A tale where fire and war delivered justice when society turned a blind eye. A tale that reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, secrets cannot remain buried forever. They rise, they burn, and they echo across generations. Thus ends the story of the forbidden marriage. It was not simply a scandal, but a mirror of a broken age. An age where pride devoured love, where legacy drowned innocence, and where silence itself was louder than the cries of truth.